Happy Easter, Don.
Happy Easter. Well, it's a special holiday because we're in a city studio on a Sunday holiday and it's still open.
Right, yeah. Good for them.
Good stuff.
In spite of all the Mormons that preempt us all the time.
Right, we get a lot of that. Holy moly. So today, if you're ready, I'm going to talk a little bit about Easter, the holiday. And I'm taking a little break from the failure series, and today I'm going to talk about some of the things that Christianity doesn't teach you in the churches, but we can fix that.
We all know Easter is nothing but a massive success.
Right. So today I have 6 fun facts about Easter. I'm going to do them real quick, and then we'll jump to callers.
Okay.
So Easter co-opts earlier traditions. The resurrecting gods are common. There was no resurrection in the original gospel. The Easter Challenge from Dan Barker, I want to talk about that. There's no point to the alleged suffering of Jesus, and you aren't really saved anyway. So, Christian Easter was has co-opted earlier traditions. There are various gods. There's the Great Mother Goddess of the Saxon people in Northern Europe, and the Teutonic Dawn Goddess of fertility. All of both of these gods have names that are very similar to Easter, Eostra or Oestra or Astara. There's a whole bunch of names, and these names are from the ancient word of spring, of Easter, E-A-S-T-R-E. And so ultimately, Easter is rooted in the spring equinox and the return of plant life in the northern hemisphere. And this is why we have bunnies and eggs and chicks and other fertility symbols. They were part of these traditions. Although eating lamb is probably comes from the the Jewish Passover.
Yeah, eating lamb is a big thing to commemorate the lambs that were slaughtered, to paint the blood on the door so that the angel of death would know to kill only the Egyptian babies and not the Jewish babies. So that's very cheerful
holiday theme, right?
And there's all kinds of symbolic stuff in the Passover tradition where you stick a lamb bone in the middle of the table, and that's representative of that.
Oh, okay. That's an obscure connection.
You also put out salt water and sip it or dip stuff in it because it represents the tears that they cried while they were slaves in Egypt. Although anthropologists are not really convinced that there ever was mass Jewish slavery in Egypt.
Oh, right.
Or a big exodus through the desert for 40 years.
Well, I'm always amused that they call him the Pharaoh rather than the name of the Pharaoh. Like,
right, yeah.
President did this to us. Or this is weird.
President Scroob.
We're not even a name. Okay, Next thing, resurrection gods are common and long predate Christianity. Attis is the Phrygian god of vegetation that predated the Jesus mythology and eventually was worshipped in ancient Rome. So ancient Rome was a melting pot of a lot of different cultures. Attis dies and is reborn every year, not just once, but every year. So that's even better. He had a miraculous birth involving an almond and promised salvation. And remind me again what Jesus did that was interesting. This all seems to be co-opted. Persephone is another mythology, is a daughter of Zeus and Demeter, the goddess of vegetation in the Greek myths. And she married the king of the underworld and rules there in the winter, returning to earth in the spring. And that explains the season. Others are Osiris and Adonis. There's many others that resurrect. And these gods explain the seasons, right? And explain why, things die off in the winter and come back in the summer and in the spring.
Right. And none of this is to say that we are necessarily mythicists, which would be to claim that Jesus was an invented character from whole cloth who was just built on the tradition of these other things. But that a lot of the traditional stuff that got worked into the story after the fact, if there was a Jesus, was borrowed from those earlier traditions, right?
Yeah, I think so. There pretty much nothing that Jesus did wasn't duplicated in some form by earlier mythologies that were also knocking around Rome at that time. So it does beg the question of whether Jesus is completely made up or an amalgam of these other myths.
Raises the question.
Raises the question. I hope more than raises the question. Okay.
People complain when you get that
So
wrong.
resurrection is a ho-hum thing, and we don't even believe in those other gods anymore, so we can kick that to the curb. Now, the earliest gospel is the Gospel of Mark, and Mark, the earliest version of the earliest gospel, actually ends at 16:8, before any resurrection, although the resurrection was alluded to, it never actually happened. And so it begs the question of, did the author not know about the resurrection, or did he not think it was important to write about it? And the multiple versions of the text that clearly follow in your Bible are clearly an embellishment, are clearly added on. And so it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder when these things showed up. The same author of Mark, we don't even know who authored it, didn't know about the virgin birth either, and that seems to be a later embellishment. So what about this resurrection thing? It doesn't seem to even be in the earliest gospel. It seems to be a later invention. Then you have all these other gospels that tell conflicting versions of the story, and Dan Barker has issued, he's a pretty famous atheist, used to be a minister, now runs with his wife the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And he asks, what happened that morning? If you take the four Gospels and 1 Corinthians and you try to coalesce them into a coherent narrative, you find all sorts of contradictions and collisions and problems, and no one has been able to reconcile all these things. Yet Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote, if Christ be not risen, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is also in vain. So think about that this Easter.
Yeah, a common response to the Easter challenge is to compare it to the witness accounts of a car wreck. Like some of them will remember different details, and they won't be completely reliable, and so and so it's understandable that there are minor variations. But the response I like to that is that the Gospels are a lot more like if there was a car wreck where one person said it happened in Cincinnati and the other one said it happened in Los Angeles.
Right, and
there are
some of them hundreds of years after the
right. I mean, we have Jesus popping up in like one city and at the same time showing up in another one that's like hundreds of miles away, which I guess ghost spirit Jesus can do, but still.
Okay. All right, there's no point to the alleged suffering of Jesus. Well, who made the rule about there needing to be a blood sacrifice for the alleged sins of mankind? Well, if God made that rule, he's kind of a monster, and he could have gotten rid of that rule. If God didn't make that rule, then apparently God's a slave to that whoever made that rule. So either way, your God's kind of nasty. Did Jesus suffer? Well, if he was a man, yeah, he suffered and he died, and he's dead. If he was a God, then and he lived on, then is there any real suffering here? I'm not so sure. He was maybe dead for a little while, but now he's the right hand of God, or the same as God. We're not quite sure. Depends on who you talk to. So either way, I don't see how this suffering benefits mankind. And what about all the suffering that Christianity has caused through the years, through their persecutions of people? And I don't see anybody who cares terribly much about that, but they all are very concerned about Jesus' suffering. And finally, you aren't really saved. Well, the doctrine of original sin and substitutive sacrifice are inherently immoral doctrines. You don't owe a debt to anybody for being born human, nor can a moral debt be paid back from you believing something. These are bogus notions. And in contrast, atheists would say, hey, personal responsibility is the way to go here. You take responsibility for your own actions, and you can't swap that responsibility with somebody else for money or power or belief or whatever. So that's really how it should be. So in my opinion, it's just a gimmick where they're breaking your leg to sell you a crutch. They're straddling you with this original sin so that you can be in debt to them somehow and get it back. So like much of the rest of Christianity, Easter and its associated concepts don't add up. And if any of this is new to you, if you're a Christian in the audience, maybe this is a reflection of the fact that your church doesn't want you to know these things. They may have figured out how to make money off of you for not knowing. So knowing the truth is your path out.